Hi, I'm Scott Schober, guest host for Cybercrime magazine, and I'm here today with Debbie Guild, the Chief Security Officer at PNC Bank, for an Ask the CISO segment, and this is sponsored by Fortinet. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Look forward to a nice conversation here.
I am too.
Excellent. Maybe we'll start out. Were you exposed to computers in high school at an earlier age, and maybe explain a little bit how so, and maybe what led you to pursue a college degree in computer science and math?
Yeah, I went to a St. Augustine High School, a very small school in Florida. In a little bit of a fluke, I quit playing the trombone halfway through my 10th grade year. There's a whole story there as well.
Did you bring your trombone with you?
I did not, and you do not want to hear me play it. But when I quit playing the trombone, the only class that was open in this small school in the mid-1980s was a computer programming class. So at the age of 15, I took my first computer programming class. And maybe it was because I didn't like playing the trombone, but I just fell in love with it from that moment. So the first moment I said that hello world, code, I was just hooked. And it's sort of interesting to have that kind of pivot that early on. So I've been a technologist, lifelong technologist, so from the age of 15, and I pretty much haven't done anything else my entire career. So. Yeah, so
pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. Excellent. Now, when you were studying computer science in college during the 1990s, did they have much curriculum that was really kind of around security, or was it more just hardcore coding and computer systems? And
So when I went to college in the 1990s, they had just pivoted from some of the mainframe coding to C coding. So I was the first generation of sort of PC computing programming. There was nothing relative to security that was offered. We had a lot relative to database management. We had assembler, so we got to go to the zeros and ones and understand how computing worked. But security wasn't really a focus, and I think it talks to how much this field has developed in 30 short years, to have it where it literally wasn't a mention in my college curriculum to now there are actual degrees relative to security, to cyber, et cetera. So it's really come a long way in a short time period.
Yeah, you see how it really has changed drastically. And my background is very similar. I grew up coding.
Right.
And when I went to college, the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't think the word security ever even came up.
It didn't.
And there was hacking and things like that, but it wasn't to the degree or the malicious intent that we have now. So,
or the pervasiveness.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so things have certainly changed a lot. So
Yeah.
I guess new careers have popped up.
Absolutely.
There's a huge demand for that. Now, you entered the workforce as a senior network engineer with Intel Corp. Did that position involve much at that time in the way of security?
It actually didn't. And again, so this was the early 90s. I was on the team that did the first iteration of the Pentium processor.
Wow.
Yeah, so
it's a nice honor.
Yeah, it was a tremendous honor. You see Andy Grove in the hallways, those types of things. But my job was to take the Pentium processor and take 256 pins, put logic probes on them, and make that thing get as hot as I could possibly get it. So I'd run Fibonacci numbers through it, which, thank God I'm a math minor, so I could do that. And all that computational power, which is sort of a good topic for even what we're seeing today, would make the processor so hot that it would literally just get paralyzed. And then we would literally look at all of the zeros and ones and figure out what failed and why. Then we'd take a little freeze spray, we'd cool it back down again, we'd watch it recover. There was no security in any of that. And again, here you are on the forefront of creating products that are going to change the way not only America, but the workforce worldwide is going to work. And to be fair, there might have been some people thinking about security, but it wasn't in my division. It wasn't something that we were worried about. it wasn't again till, as you mentioned, you started seeing some of the pervasive attacks, and you started seeing, even some of the, worldwide effects, if you will, of some of the defects, the security defects in those processors, which we just saw recently, with massive amounts of patching and then the reduction in computational power as a result of that, that you saw some of that. And it goes to the notion that security does need to be part of the design process. Cyber needs to be part of that design process. Looking at all of the good innovations and inventions and seeing how could they be used for malintent, and making sure that you're putting that in the design itself is just a huge win for anybody at that product design table to have a product that was designed with security as part of its birthright is really an important concept. But back in the early 90s, we weren't thinking about it. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say it. We weren't thinking about it at all.
Yeah, but then again, it wasn't really the mindset, as you mentioned. It wasn't baked in. It wasn't talked about. And I know I've toured the Intel Museum.
Yeah,
you might have seen some of my work up there. Yeah, so some of your work, very impressive. A lot of patents. Yeah. They hold a lot, that's for sure. But I think to your point, security really nowadays it's really kind of the primary thing when you're developing a product.
Yeah.
If that's not there at inception, you're in trouble.
You are.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. So. Good point there. Now, you spent more than 7 years at Bank of America in progressively important roles, including divisional CTO. Then you became CTO for PNC. Was it difficult to make the leap from that to CISO? And if so, maybe help us understand that.
It's a question I get asked often. So when I started at Bank of America, it was a legacy bank. So it was Barnett Bank, which was a regional bank down in Florida. And I started as an entry-level programmer, and actually spent 21 years at Bank of America. I like to say 50% of the time was on the software side, 50% of the time was on the hardware side, and then another 50% of the time was doing change work and testing work, and some of the early stages of my security career. I know that adds up to 150%. That being said, anybody in our world knows that that's a logical percentage to describe your career.
Yeah.
Exactly. When I first made my foray from, some of the coding or hardware or infrastructure roles into the security roles was when I was in that divisional CTO, and I ran the infrastructure that was the backbone of Bank of America's cybersecurity program. And, you sort of got to see, I was on sort of the earlier iterations of the initial DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks. And I started to realize that as being a part of the U.S. financial ecosystem, you are part of defending America, your critical infrastructure. If the U.S. financial ecosystem is somehow compromised, whether it's confidentiality, availability, or integrity, that's a bad day for us as a country. So you started to feel this sort of sense of mission as part of being in that security mindset. So when I came to PNC, I owned both the infrastructure and the cyber function. And what we saw this huge convergence of cyber and fraud and physical security. And what we created in 2017 is what I call this capital S security function. So we're seeing a lot of the fraud tactics being perpetuated using cyber means, right? So we had these two separate threat intelligence groups. We're like, well, they're actually looking at the same threat actors. They're looking at the same threat objectives. Why don't we bring that together, single pane of glass, and we'll be able to make it a stronger function, which is what we were able to do. From a people perspective, we see people now with better career progression, so that helps make that retention, opportunity a little bit more real. Our processes, as I just mentioned, threat intelligence, they're now connected. And then, of course, the technology. We're able to, look at, in legacy fraud, you looked at behavioral techniques. Legacy cyber, you looked at technical, signatures, right? You combine those two things, you've got a really powerful program. So we put that role to market, and it's not a market full of a whole bunch of people looking for jobs, and so we had a hard time finding the right individual. And after several months, I raised my hand to my boss and I said, you know what, this is, if you think about being at that convergence of banking, technology, and security, this is a place I want to be. This is a place that I think is going to, be, again, we've talked about Intel, be about changing the world. If we're able to help make sure that we have better identity solutions for people to prove they are who they say they are, if we're able to do real-time fraud and interdiction in a real-time payments ecosystem, which is where we are, if we're able to enable that for our constituents in a safe and secure manner, that's going to be a game changer. So I wanted to be part of that. So that's why I made that pivot, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it certainly is exciting. And if just thinking back just a couple years, look how much change in the banking industry.
Oh, yeah.
We talked earlier about chip and PIN technology.
Right.
You think about cryptocurrency, and there's some really monumental changes that are coming in the next few years that will affect the financial institutions. And I think having great people at the helm like yourself, they're keeping it safe, is really important.
And the last thing you want is an overconfident CSO. So
yes.
When you say great, I immediately think of, at any given day when I check out, I immediately think of all the things that I left on the table and didn't do.
That's good, though. That's good.
Yeah.
And you stay on top of it.
I try to, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah. That's for sure. Maybe tell us a little bit, as the CSO at PNC, maybe about the size of the enterprise, some of the employees, some of the assets, the things that you're protecting.
Yeah. So whenever you're at any enterprise, the first thing you want to do is sort of look at your, attack surface, right? And your attack surface is anything from, your data centers to your servers to the 55,000 employees to the, contractors that you have, that are, part of that elastic workforce, to the third parties that you engage. And you find that you, look at your perimeter in a different optic when you think about that. So I have a fairly large team because, as I mentioned, we combine fraud, cyber, and physical security. But we're out there every day looking at cyber risk, fraud risk, third party risk, and trying to understand for our company what investments do we need to make? How do we prioritize those investments? Really making sure that we understand where our crown jewels are and putting in, place, a lot of defense in depth. We talk about, one of my key elements of my programs, and I try to simplify this for any number of constituents, but I say, we got to make sure that we keep, the good stuff from going out and the bad stuff from coming in, right? They're like, what do you do all day, Mom? To my four kids. Well, I try to keep the good stuff in and the bad stuff from coming in. So, just really simplify the program. But that's about our size and what we do. But we have, 20,000 servers, a metro synced pair of data centers with an outer region data vault, those types of things. But pretty... and 3,000 buildings that we protect physically as well. So
a lot of assets.
That's exactly.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, help us to understand a little bit maybe about your team, the security team, because obviously you can have a great leader. You got to have a good team to really protect all of that. Maybe break the team down and help us understand who's on it and what size and the scope.
I'm going to talk a little bit about my team, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my one of my mission statements.
Sure.
So. On my team, as I mentioned, I've got, let's just say just south of 1,500 resources. And on that team, I have everything from physical security resources to people who greet you when you come into the building, to people who are investigating wire fraud, to people who are looking at all of the different events that are coming in throughout our network and looking at alerts that come in from that perspective. We have people who care about secure coding and who reach into our CIO partners to help coach them on how to code securely. And then we, of course, scan our infrastructure and look for vulnerabilities. And when we're not busy doing that, we're patching that infrastructure. Some other elements that we've set up recently are a security governance function that really makes sure that we're interacting with our agencies. I have a secure floor. On my secure floor, the people who have badge access outside of my employees are the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve. I want them to be able to come into my floor, inspect my floor, and if I'm getting something wrong, I want them to call me on it. I tell my team, you got to call your own baby ugly, but oh, by the way, I'm going to make sure that if you don't, we have 3 lines of defense plus the agencies that can help make sure that we're doing our job and we're doing it right. So that governance function is really important. The other thing that we've set up is a security architecture and engineering function. And this is where we're designing some of the products of the future that I talked about in terms of digital identity, in terms of that fraud interdiction. So we're actually creating our own strategic advantage capabilities to help make sure that we're, able to provide that seamless and secure interaction model with our customers. I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about our mission statement, and my mission statement is Together Building Trust. And I just wanted to touch on the together word because as a security function, you can't go it alone. You have to do what you're doing in concert with your customers. With your employees. So while I've got my team size, quite frankly, I count every single one of my employees as part of my team, right? You have to do it in concert with your shareholders who invest, quite frankly, a lot in my function to help protect the firm. And then the communities that you serve. So I spend a lot of time interfacing with the NCFTA, with local law enforcement, with the FBI, and with consortiums, financial services consortiums, to help make sure that we're not only protecting PNC but protecting that U.S. financial ecosystem. So when you say my team, I have these little concentric spheres of what I consider to be my team, and there's no form of success without that entire community of support around the function. It just doesn't happen.
That's neat. Definitely, it takes a team effort, certainly, to protect all that. Do you find now that financial institutions such as PNC, are you going to the dark web? Because a lot of things you mentioned sound very proactive, which is great to hear. Yeah. Are you doing dark web crawlers and looking for compromised credentials and account information? Beautiful.
Yeah, we have under our threat intelligence function, we do have not only what we have internally, but we also have third parties that do it as well. But we would be looking for not only compromised credentials, but any PNC asset that would be available. Any mentions of even, sort of threat or violence, because I do own physical security as well. But we do spend a lot of time looking there. If we're running an incident, if we're looking at, trying to connect the dots, we'll go and we'll try to see if there is any instructions. I think you're aware. I think Cyber Ventures even publishes that you can get sort of a hacking kit for $1, right? Yeah. So we'll say, is there a hacking kit out there for this that we want to investigate and see the tactics, techniques, or procedures that are out there, and that'll help us, perhaps solve a mystery for why something is occurring and or why we're seeing a particular signature. But we spend a bit of time researching the dark web and the clear web. We're scanning it all.
You got to almost get inside of a hacker's head. That way you could really curtail cybercrime.
It's one of the harder parts of I think the job is to start thinking the black swan or the black hatting of how things can go wrong. You really have to role play and put yourself into somebody else's shoes, and think differently about how to exploit something. And in doing so, the value of doing so is that you figure out how to best protect it as well. But you got to make sure that you check that at the door before you go home.
Yes. You can't take that with you.
No, right.
Not good. Not good. Excellent. Now, in what ways have you seen security change in the past 2 decades? Because you mentioned you had some interesting background at BOA, now at PNC and Intel in the past. What are some things in the past 2 decades that you've seen, Debbie?
It's an interesting question. That second word in my mission statement is Together Building Trust. And I use the word building, an active verb, because you're never done. To your point, it's always changing. I was preparing to do a presentation, and I did some research on threat intelligence, and I was like, what existed before the FBI? Like, where did we get some of this information, back in the day? And I was also doing some research on fraud. I'll get back to that in just a second. But threat intelligence started in the 1890s with Pinkerton, and they were looking for the old stagecoach robbers and the so that was their threat intelligence back in the day, and not only the stagecoach robbers or the bank robbers, those types of things. And the reason I used building was because, believe it or not, we still have bank robberies going on today. So I now have to make sure that I am looking out for not only literally the bank robbers of the 1890s, but I also have to worry about distributed denial of service attacks. I have to worry about botnets. I have to worry about the Internet of Things. I have to think about any number of threats that can come from even good things like 5G. But it's a building thing. So I've seen a huge amount of pivot, even in my, quite frankly, short career of doing it. The other thing that I researched was the origins of fraud. And, I was like, I was very... I think I'm Pollyanna-ish when I stepped into this role, and I'm like, together we're going to eliminate fraud. And then I did some research on it.
Maybe not.
It's like, as long as there's been any notion of value, there's been fraud. And I think, according to Wikipedia, the first noted fraud was back in 300 BC. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to get rid of it. That's going to happen now. But it was, it was a merchant ship, and they had insured the value of the contents of the ship, and then so you see some things change dramatically, but the motives stay the same. Right? So the threat objectives are still the same. So if you understand the motives, it helps you, again, sort of simplify the problem statement. So being a math minor, you want to sort of reduce those variables. But if you go back to the motives, you can then see, okay, then how are you going to protect yourself from the different motives that might then be out there. But you can't get overwhelmed with DDoS, with botnets, with IoT, with all the things that are sort of coming at you. You can get a little overwhelmed. But if you simplify it and think about what are the objectives, whether it's money or disruption, or theft of intellectual property, what are the objectives? And that helps simplify how you're going to approach your job every day.
Yeah. Lots of different things to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I like how you brought out the point, too, about in the world of cybersecurity, you have to also tie in and think about physical security, too.
Yes.
Especially a bank with all different types of assets. You have to really think the bigger picture to protect everything.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well said. And how about the cloud? Let's talk about the cloud for a minute.
Yeah.
Does the cloud pose special challenges to large enterprises such as you're part of when they transition parts of the system and the applications there and all those moving pieces? What do you think?
It does. I am a little bit, I view it as sort of a risk equation, right? And so you have to make sure that you're using the right hosting schema for the right risk pattern. And you need to sort of make sure that you're identifying your risk appetite relative to that and putting sensitive data where you think it should be and not where you think it should not be. I also long ago sort of eliminated myself from thinking that you're fully protected by this notion of a perimeter. And when you're in a cloud hosting schema, you have to sort of think of that as sort of perimeter-less protection, right? And I've had two really good mentors in my life. One is a retired brigadier general from the Air Force, and one is a former Secretary of the Navy. And we talked a lot about how in the armed forces they look at perimeter defense, and the reality for them is the perimeter is a ship. It's a fighter. It's a sub. It's
large tangible asset. Or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I sort of think of the cloud in the same way. It's sort of a different hosting schema, and I got to think about how to protect it differently. And so, we put together, sort of a special focus on how we're going to secure data in the cloud. And we make sure that there's these foundational controls that we can inspect and that we know, are in force. But again, we spend a lot of time really making sure that we understand what data belongs where and why, and doing sort of right-based hosting and not just sort of saying we're cloud first. That's not who we are. We're, more around making sure that we've got a very deliberate focus on what should be hosted where and for the right reasons.
Excellent. Yeah. Let's talk IoT, Internet of Things devices. How secure are they, Debbie? What do you think? And maybe how difficult is it for you and your security teams to really truly protect them in your enterprise? Yeah,
it's so it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Security by design is not a flagship statement for things that are in the Internet of Things. It becomes sort of an afterthought. So things like patching protocols for the Internet of Things do not exist. Things like security hardening guidelines that we leverage in terms of desktops and mobile devices and servers, they don't exist for the Internet of Things. So they pose a special challenge. And when you think about them from a product perspective, all those things that I just described, that makes them a concern. But then you add the other word, which is pervasiveness. Like they're everywhere. We're probably wearing them as we speak. So in terms of both the wearables and then, homes, smart cities, et cetera, they're pervasive. So you have things that aren't necessarily patchable and you have a pervasive number of them, that creates a problem. So I just created a little equation there. So it's something that we have to make sure that, as an industry, we're aware of. It doesn't mean it's not solvable. It means that we need to make sure that we've got the right program to address it. But it's something that we're going to, have to wrestle with for a while until manufacturers have either, by doing the right thing, put together sort of, security by design products, or there's, additional regulation. So either commercial pressure or regulatory pressure needs to sort of come to the table and help make sure that we're getting the right level of rigor in terms of the security hardening practices for IoT.
Yeah. And I'm guessing too, with your background at Intel, of anybody understanding the hardware side, it takes a big effort.
Yes,
It's a huge investment, but it's got to be done up front. That's really the key with IoT.
Yeah, you'd think that there'd be enough cautionary tales out there for us to get on the bandwagon here, but I think there's still some work in front of us on that one.
More to be done, that's for sure. Yeah. Now, according to Cybersecurity Ventures, there'll be 3.5 million unfulfilled cybersecurity jobs by 2021, and that's up from 1 million from back in 2014. Now, that's a 350% increase over the span of 8 years. From your opinion, Debbie, how difficult is it to recruit experienced cybersecurity people in this climate today?
It is a challenge. It's something that is a focus. On any given day, I'm thinking about my human resources equation. But you mentioned a keyword, people, recruiting people with cyber experience. I think part of our role as well is to develop people with cyber experience. Finding those crossover moments in terms of, careers that, you can start maybe as my HR partner, but all of a sudden, maybe I can pivot you into sort of more of a domain role, but leveraging that people management capability. So those crossover moments are really huge for us. Developing people from a pipeline perspective, in their younger days, when you and I were having our preamble, I asked about your daughter, and I said, "Oh, great opportunity to recruit somebody into the cyber profession." So that's really important. But really ensuring that you have a disciplined program around how you're developing, how you're attracting, and how you're retaining people in the career is hugely important, and really making sure that you've created a diverse and inclusive place to work is incredibly important. You hear people talk about diversity, which is one part of the equation. But if you aren't creating sort of that inclusive, just culture, you're not going to attract people to your function, and you'll lose them to the competitor. You have to create that great place to work, or you'll lose on that end of the equation. People say it's a war on talent, not to be those. I think that's a little bit cliche. I mean, I think you do have to create a great place to work, and I think that you have to be part of the ecosystem to develop more people in the discipline, whether they're going to work for you or not. It's a great career. It's a great job. Talking about it with young folks is a huge part of what I do.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So it's really kind of creating this culture that will really attract the talent and retain it ultimately.
Absolutely.
That's really fundamental, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, you have people going to 4-year colleges for degrees where there may or may not be a job. Like if you want, I'm going to guarantee that you're going to get a job. You get any one of the either computing or cyber degrees, and I'll guarantee you will have employment.
Yeah. Excellent. The unemployment rate is 0% in our industry. That's kind of unheard of in the world we live in today. In such a competitive market, does that make it difficult to retain people? Again, talking about this retention from where you sit.
It does if you are struggling with creating a great place to work. You have to make sure that you attract talent who I think is sort of mission oriented. There, for a while, was a little bit of a demographic in the cyber talent that was sort of mercenary. They would come in, stay for a year and a half.
Yeah.
They would bring their friends with them, and then they would go. And we, as hiring managers, we participated in that, and we stopped doing that, about 3 years ago. Because for one, do unto others as you want done to you. So I wouldn't sort of, if somebody came to me and then they wanted to sort of decimate their former organization, I said no, not on my watch, because I don't want people to do that to me, right? So we sort of stopped the cycle, but then we also made sure that people saw our organization as a place to grow. And we made sure that as we hired people, we weren't hiring people who had done that 2-year stint. We looked at that, and that's, I actually wouldn't even have conversations with people who had done 2 years.
Jump.
I wouldn't have the conversation with them, because I didn't want to have to deal with somebody coming in, getting up to speed on the culture, and then leaving. And you need more than 2 years to really deliver against a defined mission such as I've mentioned. So the big art in retaining is creating a great place to work, making sure that you're bringing in people who match your culture. You're not looking to solve a problem, you're looking to achieve a mission. And when you hire to solve a problem, that's when you're going to start getting those 2-year folks, and not necessarily people who are mission oriented, career oriented, and who can see your organization as a place to learn and grow.
Interesting. Now, let me get your perspective on this. What more can be done to get more girls and women involved with cybersecurity? We hear a lot more about women in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
What do you think, Debbie?
So I'm on the board of the National Center for Women in Technology.
Okay.
So
Excellent.
It's a huge part of what I feel my role is now, is making sure that we're attracting young women into not only the technological fields, but for me specifically, the cyber fields. It starts at a young age. You see, with the beautiful thing about, even I have 4 sons, but my sons in gaming is it actually introduces them into computing. And so we get to have a lot of conversations, with my sons about program or be programmed, those types of things. So I'm like, do you want to be on the leading edge of that, or do you want to, be on the receiving end of that? With young ladies, there aren't that many introductory moments as there are for young men, which is a little bit of a shame, because the early computing was actually defined by women. Ada Lovelace, the Grace Hopper.
A lot of great history there.
Exactly. So part of what we do at NC WIT is we try to make sure that we meet young ladies where they are. So girls who code. We find young ladies who have shown sort of an aspiration in computing, and we say, hey, you're good at it. We give them a community of support, and they actually stay with it. And just as the simple act of one introducing it to young ladies, and then telling them they're good at it, and encouraging them, has a wonderful effect. I mean, we saw I think it was 92% of the young ladies that we identified stayed with computing.
Wow,
once
great.
we sort of intervened. But Girl Scouts has a great program, and as I mentioned, Girls Who Code. There's all sorts of resources out from a National Center for Women in Technology, ncwit.org, it's just a huge part of who I am, is to really make sure that, at this point in my career, you get to hear about the early days, but, at this point in my career, it's a huge part of what I do is sponsoring, women in technology and in cyber, and making sure that we're creating that diverse workforce and creating an inclusive place for them to, grow when they do enter the workforce.
That's beautiful. Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for joining us today, Debbie. Really nice conversation. And again, this has been an Ask the CISO segment. It's brought to you by Fortinet.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for a great conversation.